There we go. I am Libby Schultz. I'll be moderating today's webinar. We'd like to welcome our presenters, Dan Feldman, Principal Software Engineer at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and Umar Khan, Product Marketing Lead at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Excuse me. A few housekeeping items before we get started. During the webinar, you're not able to talk as an attendee. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to drop your questions there and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. This is an official webinar of the CNCF and as such is subject to the CNCF Code of Conduct. Please do not add anything to the chat or questions that would be in violation of that code of conduct. Basically, please be respectful of all your fellow participants and presenters. Please also note that the recording and slides will be posted later today to the CNCF webinar page at www.cncf.io/webinars. And with that, I will hand it over to Dan and Umair.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be talking about SPIFFE and SPIRE in practice. Just curious, just put in the chat window, how many of you already know about SPIFFE and SPIRE? Just a +1 in the chat window. And just to make sure everyone is focused. So while we wait for that, Dan, if you want to move to the next slide. We'll do a quick recap for, oh, wow, I see a lot of +1s. So we'll do a quick recap of SPIFFE and SPIRE. We won't spend too much time on it. So that if, I see a couple of you are new to SPIFFE and SPIRE. So just wanted to make sure that, we have context for everyone. And then we'll start going into a deep dive into some of the use cases that we have seen SPIFFE community members using the projects for. Next slide, please. Next slide. So just to give you a quick recap, SPIFFE and SPIRE are part of CNCF. HP is one of the contributors. There are other vendors, other enterprise organizations, cloud native organizations that are all contributing and adopting code to the projects. And I hope some of the organization includes, some of the folks on this call as well. The projects have recently moved to the incubate stage now at CNCF, and it's tightly integrated to various open source projects such as Envoy, Nginx, HashiCorp Vault, and a bunch of others as well. And we have seen more and more public organizations talking about how they're adopting SPIFFE and SPIRE, and some of the 5 use cases or 5 patterns or practices that we have seen across this company, we are sharing this as well. Next slide, please. So if you take a step back, what problem do SPIFFE and SPIRE solve? And not spending too much time on it because it seems like a lot of you already have basic knowledge of SPIFFE and SPIRE. Everyone is seeing this explosion of cross-service communications. You have all these software services running across multiple platforms. In the old age, they used to run within your data center. Now they run outside your data center, on partner side, on multiple cloud platforms. And as you adopt microservices-based architecture, this problem is even more complex. And now there's a risk of all these long-lived service credentials across different platforms. And these platforms have their own specific way of managing credentials for these software services. But still, every day we hear about a new leakage of some sort that happened of credentials across the board. So there's a security problem that we are solving. But next slide, if there's also what you call, I don't want to use the word DevSecOps, but an operational complexity issue that we are trying to solve as well. The fact that you have multiple authentication mechanisms, multiple ways of identifying software services or saving your credentials across different platforms, it's a toll on development teams and platform teams as well, because they have to learn credential management that's very platform specific at times, or they have to do their own authentication mechanisms or write some custom codes or learn encryption or integrate with existing systems. So they spend a lot of time in this when they should be focused on the business logic. And at the same time, the security teams as well, they're afraid, of their developer and platform teams at times. And they make sure that these development organizations or platform engineering organizations are abiding by their, compliance and audit requirements. And they have proper mechanism of securing secrets and securing credentials for different applications. And there's a lot of cycles that they are spending as well. Next slide, please. And SPIFFE and SPIRE really provide a mechanism of managing, giving you this central universal identity control plane to manage across platforms. And Dan is going to talk a bit more about the problem they're solving in a quick overview.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Umair. So there's this expression for infinite regression called "it's turtles all the way down," and we actually wrote a book just a couple months ago called "Solving the Bottom Turtle," which you can get here. But what we're referring to there is that in every security system, you've got a chain of trust. So you've got maybe a certificate for your service that then depends on a secret store from the platform, some kind of identity for the platform. Usually it comes down to your initial configuration, the join tokens you use to set up Kubernetes, the certificates you install on the servers that then depend on a certificate authority that you configure manually. What we're really doing with SPIFFE and SPIRE is we're providing what we call that bottom turtle, the end to the infinite regression, where we can distribute the root certificates, the root of trust, to everyone throughout your system without depending on any kind of initial configuration. We can get that straight from your cloud provider, straight from your hardware, straight from your configuration software, and not have to depend on some kind of leaky abstraction at the bottom to provide the root of trust for your infrastructure. So the key concepts behind SPIFFE and SPIRE that you need to understand in order to understand how they work. First of all, we've defined this thing called a SPIFFE ID. This is a standard format for identifying services in your network. It looks just like a URL. This is really easy. It's just a string starting with SPIFFE://. And then it has a trust domain component, which is unique to your organization, and then a name for your service. That's all it is. Then we've come up with these definitions for SPIFFE verifiable identity documents. And these are cryptographically verifiable documents that assert specific SPIFFE IDs. And when I say cryptographically verifiable document, that sounds scary. What we're really talking about is X509 certificates and JavaScript Web Tokens, or JWTs. And both of those formats are available. The advantage of using the X509 certificates, of course, is you can use that to establish TLS connections that are mutually authenticated on both sides. And then the advantage of the JavaScript Web Tokens is you can use them in all kinds of situations that require JavaScript Web Tokens. Then there are trust bundles. These are the public keys that can be used to verify SVIDs. So it's a single file format that SPIFFE is synchronizing all the time between all the nodes in your infrastructure that allows any service to verify any SPIFFE verifiable identity document in that trust domain. So this is just like the root certificate bundle that comes with your operating system or your web browser, except there's just one tweak, which is that it works with both those JavaScript Web Tokens or X509 certificates, but that's really a minor detail. And this is in a standard format that actually a lot of different services already understand. And finally, there's the workload API, and this is the most important and maybe the most subtle part of SPIFFE. This is a local API that allows workloads to retrieve their SPIFFE ID, their SVID, and their trust bundle. So why do they have to retrieve them instead of just storing them statically? The reason is we're constantly updating the SPIFFE verifiable identity documents and the trust bundles. By default, we have a lifetime for these identity documents of 4 hours. So they're constantly rotating. And this is what makes SPIFFE really different from any other kind of public key infrastructure that you might have worked with, even though the file formats are the same. All the credentials are constantly changing under the hood, which is why you need this workload API that's constantly pushing these documents to your services. Now, when I say it's a local API, why is it a local API? Well, if it was a remote API, you'd need some kind of authentication to connect to it. So instead, it's just a local API. You have one per instance of the operating system, and services can connect to that local API and get the right SVID and trust bundle and SPIFFE ID in order to interact with the rest of your infrastructure. So what are the core differentiators of SPIRE compared to other types of infrastructure security products? And I should just clarify that SPIFFE is the open standard for what we're doing with distributing trust bundles and SVIDs and SPIFFE IDs to infrastructure, and SPIRE is our implementation. So with SPIRE, we're doing this real-time attestation of all the services in your infrastructure. So if it's a Kubernetes service, we're talking to Kubernetes and verifying that your Kubernetes service account that you're using is what it's supposed to be according to the configuration. We can check the hardware. If you have a TPM, we can check the system integrity using Linux system integrity measurements. One thing I'm working on a lot right now is checking if the binary that's running has been signed by the CI/CD pipeline. And we'll have a demo, or sorry, we'll have a little bit more on that later on. So we've got all these different attestations to make sure that every service is who it's supposed to be. And again, these are all short-lived credentials, and they're rotating frequently every couple of hours. So you don't necessarily need to worry about revoking certificates or having too many certificates outstanding because they're changing all the time. And we're reducing the overhead associated with the credential management. So none of this is a human process. The security engineers just need to configure it at the beginning, and then SPIRE will distribute all the key material to all the services that are supposed to have it. Now, it's an extensible architecture. We have users with hundreds of thousands of nodes already using many different SPIRE servers that are interlinked. So this is really ready for web scale environments in a way that a lot of similar security products aren't quite yet.
Yep, great.
Umair, would you like to introduce this section?
Yeah, I think now we're going to go a bit deeper into the use cases, what folks are using SPIFFE and SPIRE for. Naturally, it's great to have your entire infrastructure running on SPIRE and authenticating across the board, but these are some of the unique problems or unique angles other users are using SPIFFE and SPIRE for. I know there's already a question by Jacob. Dan, I wanted to give you a heads up. The question is around how is it different than service mesh. I think you covered that in a couple of slides anyway, so just wanted to give you a heads up. I think he also is asking about integration with Linkerd. We don't do direct integration with Linkerd yet, but Dan will explain that in much more detail in a bit.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so one of the first things that people want to do with SPIFFE and SPIRE is simply to establish mutually mutual TLS connections between two services. So if you're in Kubernetes, you have two services, maybe they're running on two different nodes. SPIFFE and SPIRE, well, first of all, you set up a SPIRE server and then an agent running on each node. This is just a daemon set in Kubernetes terminology. And it's giving each service its SVID, its trust bundle, and its SPIFFE ID. On this side also has its SVID, trust bundle, and SPIFFE ID. And then remember, one of the formats that's available for those SVIDs is an X509 certificate. So then these services can simply establish a mutual TLS connection. Now, like Jacob just said in the question, how is this any different from service mesh? Because a lot of service meshes can do this initially. Well, the first thing, and something that a lot of our users are really interested in, is that we have that low-level attestation. So we're actually talking at a low level to your hardware, to your cloud provider, to the Kubernetes platform, which I guess most of the service meshes would be able to do, in order to verify that each service is who it really says it is. So that's the first differentiator. And then the second is really simple. If you have two different platforms, maybe one's running in Kubernetes, one's running in Mesos, one's running on Windows, one's running on a raw EC2 instance. As long as those platforms all have the SPIRE agents configured, they can still establish mutual TLS connections. And none of the service meshes really offer that. Some of them are trying to break outside the Kubernetes world a little bit, but they're usually not quite there yet, except for Consul, which is more in HashiCorp land, et cetera. Each service mesh is usually tied to a platform, while SPIRE is platform agnostic. Now, as far as actually using these SVIDs, these certificates or JOTs, in order to connect to other services, well, there's a couple different options. One is your service you can change the code to directly talk to the SPIRE agent and get its SVID dynamically. Another option is we provide a utility called SPIFFE Helper. which literally just gets the SVID certificate and saves it to a file, and then signals your service every time that changes. That's actually really useful for integrating with pre-existing databases, other kinds of code that you don't really want to change. And we've provided scripts that help integrate SPIFFE helper with Postgres and MySQL, that sort of thing. And finally, the most common configuration is actually to just use Envoy, talking to the SPIRE agent to fetch its certificates, because then you get all the other good things that Envoy provides in terms of load balancing and observability, logging, all this amazing stuff that Envoy can provide. And then you can just add, it's literally 4 or 5 lines of configuration in order to get the SVID and the trust bundle in order to establish mutual TLS connections. And of course, most of the service meshes are using Envoy as well. And if you're very careful, you can get the service mesh configuration to cooperate with the SPIRE configuration in Envoy. So as a comparison to service meshes, so we can work across different service meshes and outside service meshes. We have this lower level attestation. We're talking to the hardware, we're talking to the cloud, and you have more fine-grained control over certificates. So you can change some details of the certificates that some users really want to be able to control, like the DNS names that are in the CN for the certificate. That's actually really helpful for some users, or they want to be able to have some intermediate certificate authority. That's really hard to configure with a service mesh. So Umair has a great customer quote on this use case.
Yeah, I think definitely what like Dan mentioned, including me and Dan and I think about 10 more community members from different organizations came together last month to create a book, and that included some case studies where users like Uber, Square, Pinterest, Anthem, and a bunch of others, and those can be found in their book as well. And Uber is a great example. They've always been talking about publicly about how they're using SPIFFE and SPIRE, and really started, if you look at any of their videos on YouTube or any of the studies that they've done with CNCF, is basically they had this next gen infrastructure based on microservices that they realized they have this legacy, not in a bad way, but traditional infrastructure as well that they built out, and they are using SPIRE as a bridge, not only within the next gen infrastructure, but also in their legacy infrastructure as well. So it's like end-to-end standard authentication across the board. I think, Dan, now, if you want, maybe you can go a bit deep dive into how we work with service mesh. I think you covered how we are different than service meshes, but now let's say, how do we work together with service mesh? And Jacob, feel free to type another question if your existing question wasn't clear.
Yeah, so this section is called Build and Bridge Service Mesh, which is exactly on that topic, which is on using SPIRE alongside service meshes. So if you've got some kind of a mesh daemon here, like an Istio agent or any of the service meshes, you can have the SPIRE agent running alongside it. And both of them, like I said, can talk to your Envoy proxy. This is a little bit of a generic slide because it doesn't specify any particular service mesh. But then you can use you can use SPIRE to establish connections in a secure way between multiple different service meshes. And this is really important because we're working with a lot of huge companies that have what I'd call heterogeneous infrastructure. They have a lot of different teams using different platforms with different ideas about what the best service mesh is. Maybe they're buying a product from someone else that includes a service mesh inside it. That's something we've come across. So establishing secure communications between service meshes is actually really important to a lot of users. And again, if you have a standalone instance, maybe that isn't running inside Kubernetes, isn't running inside your service mesh at all, you can still establish that secure connection. Now, a couple of the service meshes are actually integrating with SPIRE in various ways. So AWS App Mesh in their beta actually does support using SPIRE to obtain all its certificates. Gray Matter, Kuma, Nginx Service Mesh, those guys are using SPIRE to provide their certificates natively. Istio was actually started at around the same time as the SPIRE project. So it actually produces SPIRE compatible certificates. There are some minor differences, but we can make them work together. It just takes a little bit of extra configuration in Istio, but we do have users using Istio and Spire seamlessly together. Network service mesh and open service mesh both use Spire in different ways. It's a little bit complicated to explain, and those ones are still sort of emerging at this point. But we're working closely with those teams to make sure that that they're using Spire in a way that's compatible with everyone else.
Yeah, great. I think there have been a lot of experiments being done by the community as well. I think, I don't know if you attended the last SPIFFE Production Identity Day, a co-located event at KubeCon. IBM shared how they have actually retrofitted Spire within Istio and replaced their cert management capability with Spire just because they wanted that stronger attestation piece. Again, that's more of an official experiment, but they have definitely shared the code and everything as well. If anyone is interested, I can definitely put the link to that as well. So now we talked about microservices. We talked about service mesh, how we play with those SPIFFE Inspire projects. Another thing really rudimentary, if you look at, if you go to the next slide, it's all of a sudden when organizations are adopting Kubernetes and container-based infrastructures and tooling, they still have some. These services need to access that are not running on containers, right, or on the same container platform, right? And they typically end up, generating managing credentials or using some sort of username password-based access to these services. But what we have seen some of the organizations, especially at the start of their journey, they start with, hey, I have this app, payroll app that runs on, this Kubernetes clusters on-prem or, a flavor of a cloud. It needs to access this S3 bucket or this database, right? How do you do that without, going through 5 tools or generating username, passwords, and credentials and that sort of stuff? What Spire really allows you to do in the next slide, as Dan will show you, is basically, it eliminates the need to generate and manage these credentials. So Spire can act as a bridge and can use built-in PKI capabilities within databases, let's say, to use Spire-based certificates to access to databases, or things like OIDC, which OpenID Connect, which Dan is going to mention that as well, and really securely authenticate into an S3 bucket or an RDS or things like that. So this is another getting started use case a lot of organizations are excited about when they start using SPIFFE and Spire as well. Dan, you want to go a bit deeper on that and show us a demo?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, here's a bit of an architecture diagram of how you might authenticate to AWS using your Spire certificates. So you can configure Spire to present the public keys of the trust bundle in an OIDC federation format. So you create a public HTTP endpoint, and then AWS IAM can natively federate with that. So any user who's established on the Spire side can then access AWS resources like S3 storage or the RDS database. And I'm actually going to be showing this use case in a second. And then another way to do this is you can, sorry, this diagram is a little bit wrong. I just realized that. But you can use this to authenticate to Postgres, basically using the same thing, even outside of AWS. This shouldn't say AWS APIs, but you can use the same OIDC federation mechanism to authenticate to a Postgres database or several other different types of databases. And I really love this use case because there's no secret that's anywhere that can be stolen, that can be accidentally left enabled. Instead, every service has its identity directly attested by the hardware, by the cloud infrastructure, and then used in order to authenticate to resources. So I do have a quick demo here. This is recorded because otherwise it would take way too long. But I'll just go through this quickly. So this is an app we created just as a demo app to simulate a common customer use case. This is a bank called Scrooge McBank. And this is showing the user's current balance and then their recent transactions, both of which come from different services that are running in AWS. But the main bank backend is not running in AWS. So if I play this demo, you can see the balance, you can see the transactions. Now on the AWS side, what we've done is we've created an AWS IAM role. You can't see the role, but this is the identity policy document for the role. And as you can see, sorry, if I get this set up, I can draw for you. So what's here is these are the SPIFFE IDs that are allowed to assume the role. You can see transaction service, balance service. These are allowed to access the AWS role in order to fetch that data from a database. And then this here, this is the location of the OIDC identity provider. So this is actually a public HTTP endpoint that's serving those public keys for the on-prem services that are outside AWS. So then if I keep playing,
Now it's playing then.
okay, got it. So then in the next step of the demo here, we're actually showing the JOT tokens. And these are the tokens that are provided by SPIRE. And I know you can't read a JOT token unless you're much smarter than I am, but we've decoded these using the JOT utility. And you can see the token that's provided by SPIRE. You can see there's the SPIFFE ID on the, so again, this is the client that's accessing AWS. And you can see when it was issued. You can see that it expires very shortly after it was issued because this is a short-lived token. And then just to demonstrate that this is really what's happening, we can change the policy document on the AWS side just to have a invalid SPIFFE ID here. And what will happen is now that SPIFFE ID that the client is using can no longer talk to AWS, it can't load those transactions anymore. So what we're showing here is really a powerful idea, and that's a little bit subtle. It's a little bit not what people mostly do, but we're authenticating a client very strongly in order to access AWS without any token, without any static certificate, without any username and password. And then that client can access AWS resources. And this is probably the most powerful use case for SPIFFE and SPIRE, certainly the one that I like evangelizing the most, but it's a little bit subtle because most organizations aren't able to do anything like this quite yet.
Yeah.
And great. There we go.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think there was another question around utilizing SPIRE with Lambda functions. I think there's a proposal out in the community about Lambda. Is that correct?
Oh, that's a great question. So Square Payments actually uses Lambda functions extensively, and they are right now using SPIRE with Lambda functions. It's a little bit experimental, and it's a little bit tuned for their use case. We've got a proposal, sort of an RFC that's out to the SPIRE community for a way to implement Lambda functions a little bit more formally, with a couple of different options for how to do it with pros and cons. That'll be coming into SPIRE relatively soon, within the next, hopefully the next 6 months, at least the next year. And we'll be able to authenticate serverless functions. It's not quite there yet, unless you follow Square's instructions. They have a blog post, actually. If you Google Square, SPIRE, serverless, all three words there, Square, SPIRE, serverless, you'll get a blog post from the Square team about how they got it to work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll post that shortly as well. So going to the next one, like you can go ahead, go to the next slide then. And going to the next slide, like another use case that we've seen a lot of users come in. Zero trust is definitely a big buzzword these days, right? And the reason is organizations realize that because their organization boundaries are blurring. The traditional network-based firewalls and network-based firewalls, not balls, were basically are not enough. Folks are using network segmentation-based tools. That's pretty hard to do as well at times, especially because the boundaries are blurring between their data centers and cloud-based infrastructures. And particularly when the notion of an IP address is going away, when you have all these dynamic technologies, cloud or containers going up and down continuously, right? So the security, parameter-based security is going away, and we have seen more and more organizations adopt this zero trust model, right? And next slide, please. And zero trust, for those, I'm sure everyone pretty much has heard the word zero trust here, is basically this shift, right? Going away from, building this trusted wall across your network. And yes, all those technologies are important, but going to the next level, right? Naturally, they are a lot harder to do in cloud-based and dynamic infrastructures, but at the same time, if someone gets access to your network, they can pretty much create havoc, right? So we've seen a lot of organizations adopting the zero trust model that at its core believes in identifying, authenticating every request. It doesn't matter where it runs on, but in identifying the request. And if you look at service identity or workload identity, that's where SPIFFE and SPIRE come in as well. So if you have zero trust initiatives, if your network teams have zero trust initiatives, if you are working in a network team as well, do share, the applicability of SPIFFE and SPIRE there, right? Dan, could you give us some bit more context how SPIRE fits in the zero trust model?
Yeah, sure. So we do have users who are really interested in just doing zero trust everything. Every connection between services anywhere in their heterogeneous infrastructure has to use mutual TLS with an identity provided by a trusted authority that can check that service's real credentials. So in these cases, you've got an identity provider, which is SPIRE, giving out those SFIDs to cloud resources, maybe in one cloud, maybe a different region of a different cloud, on-prem resources in the data center, SaaS providers, managed databases. That's a use case we've seen is actually pushing those SPIRE credentials in as the user credentials to access managed databases like RDS. So each service would get its own unique, secure, and provable identity. And one of the users that's really interested in this is Anthem, which is a huge health insurance company with a lot of organizational complexity, like a lot of older businesses, a lot of different stuff going on with different divisions and subdivisions and partners. And they want to implement zero trust security throughout their entire organization. Umer, did you have anything else to add on this one?
No, like I mentioned, these practitioner stories are available in that book as well. And they definitely bring to life why users and are actually using SPIFFE and SPIRE. So at Anthem, if you ask them, it was pretty much driven top down because they were building this next gen infrastructure and wanted to adopt a zero trust security model. They started with exploring CNCF technologies, zero trust radius technologies, and that's how they came across SPIRE and a bunch of other products. Because the end goal is to move towards a zero trust security posture or security model, however you would define that.
So then the last section here is reducing the risk of rogue containers. Umer, did you want to introduce this?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we, especially in the CNCF community as well, because we have a lot of DevOps flows or infrastructure folks or people who manage DevOps pipelines and things of that sort. So there's a value of SPIFFE and SPIRE there as well, right? For the end developer, because the complexity is gone and they get this consistent dial tone API. So there's a lot of risks that you take away from it that Dan is going to talk about.
Sure. So this is something I'm working on a lot actually with Anthem these days, is configuring the CI/CD system so that it generates the SPIRE configuration. So as you have source code, it's being built by the CI/CD system. It's building a container. What we can do is we can add to that. We can have the CI/CD system talk. Obviously, it's building the container. We can have it also talk to the SPIRE server via the SPIRE server's API and say, this container with this identity should get this SPIFFE ID. So the cool thing about this is that no containers that haven't gone through the CI/CD system or aren't otherwise configured have any access to the identity infrastructure. They can't even connect to any other services. Or if a malicious user somehow changes the contents of a container, then that container will no longer be able to get an identity. So this is something we're working on. There isn't any new code required for this because the The pieces are all there, but we're working on some configuration and examples and documentation in order to popularize this idea. So we're essentially signing the container and then using that signature to be able to establish secure identities that the container, when it's running, can use to connect to other containers. And this is a really powerful idea. I'm really looking forward to getting this out there a little bit more. Another thing that some of our users are really interested in, this is really simple, but it's just having two different SPIRE environments for their dev and prod workloads, or their dev and staging and prod workloads, so that a user on the dev side can't accidentally deploy something that messes with prod. And again, you're probably doing this using some kind of perimeter mechanism like VPCs or having different AWS accounts. That starts to fall apart if each of these environments maybe consists of components running in multiple different clouds. You can't establish a perimeter easily. So one way around that is you can use SPIRE to provide unique identities for each of those environments so they can't talk to each other. And this is essentially the same idea, just having two different dev and prod SPIRE environments. And then our last user quote is here for Umair.
Yeah. So I guess ByteDance and TikTok are another one of the big users and high skill users of SPIFFE and SPIRE, and they have multiple talks on the project that you can find as well. And actually, Eli was one of the book writers as well. This book. Again, their interest in SPIFFE and SPIRE started when they were looking for this consistent dial tone authentication. Dial tone authentication is a word that Google has used in the past with a system called Google Alts now. It used to be called LOS. I hope I'm saying the right acronym. But the concept was that authentication needs to be consistent everywhere, just like dial tone. If you remember, if you pick up a phone, a wired phone, and you hear the dial tone, it's no matter where in world you pick up the phone, you hear the same dial tone, right? Similar concept with authentication. So it reduces the complexities of managing encryption, credentials, and all that kind of stuff from development teams. But at the same time, security teams sleep a lot happier because it's consistent across the board, and there are fewer risks, like Dan mentioned, and no one's going to accidentally use test credentials in production and everything crashes as well, right? That's a non-security related benefit. I think with that we covered a lot of content for you. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat right now. And we really hope that these 5 use cases get you started on SPIFFE and SPIRE projects. Dan, if you can go to the next slide. Do join us on slack.spiffe.io. We have almost close to 1,000 engineers now on SPIFFE Slack. You'll find me and Dan there. I help manage community. Dan is naturally one of the contributors. The book that I keep talking about, The Bottom Turtle, it's a great place for you to understand basic concepts around identity, around SPIFFE, how it relates to other tools, if you're doing deployment, some of that stuff, and these practitioner stories that we borrowed from there. That book is available freely for everyone to use, to quote, to use in presentations, if you're trying to convince your broader team to adopt SPIFFE and SPIRE as well. The GitHub link is there too. Please follow us there too. And I'm going to do a shameless plug as well. Start the projects too, if you like them and use them. But hopefully looking forward to seeing a lot of you on the SPIFFE Slack channel over the coming months. Any questions? While we wait and give chance to everyone to ask any questions, Dan, any closing remarks you want to add, or?
No, but in case you have a question and you can't formulate it quite now, feel free to email us. Both of our email addresses should be in the session description, or you can contact us on the SPIFFE Slack, which is like Umair said, it's a pretty active Slack. A lot of users from a lot of different companies and a lot of really good ideas for how to use SPIFFE and SPIRE. And if you ever encounter a problem or just need a link to resources, you can ask on Slack and get an answer pretty quickly, almost any time of day or night in the US or Europe. And I guess if we don't have any questions, well, I'll stop sharing and maybe we can wait for another minute to see if there are any follow-ups.
Sure. Yeah. Is there anything else y'all want to cover in the time you have left?
I think it was pretty good. I think 45 minutes of content. Thank you everyone for staying that long. But I really hope, Jacob, your questions, Leonardo, your questions were answered. Anything else we can help you with? Was this session useful? Did it expand your knowledge of SPIFFE Inspire? Did we confuse you more? Or what else should we cover in future webinars?
Great job, y'all. Thanks so much for a great presentation. We'll wait around for a little bit, see if anybody else has a question for another minute or so, but thank you everyone for joining us. The slides will be up later today on the CNCF website along with the recording. And if there are no more questions, we will look forward to seeing you at a future webinar, and I'll let everybody go.
Thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon or morning, depending on where you are.